On October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday hit Wall Street. Investors traded some 16 million shares on the New York Stock Exchange in a single day, and billions of dollars were lost, wiping out thousands of investors. Stock prices began to decline in September and early October 1929, and on October 18th, the fall began. Panic set in, and on October 24th, Black Thursday, and nearly $13 million shares were traded, a record for the time. Investment companies and leading bankers attempted to stabilize the market by buying up great blocks of stock, producing a moderate rally on Friday. On Monday, however, the storm broke anew and the market went into freefall. Black Monday was followed by Black Tuesday, October 29th, in which stock prices collapsed completely and more than 16 million shares were traded on the New York Stock Exchange in a single day. Stock tickers ran hours behind because the machinery could not handle the tremendous volume of trading. What happened in 3 black days in October 1929 was nothing minor. By the end of November 1929, investors had lost $100 billion in assets in what was soon dubbed the Great Crash. Stock prices continued to fall in the coming years, bottoming out on July 8, 1932. Black Tuesday effectively ended a prosperous era called the Roaring Twenties and ushered in the Great Depression. The stock market crash was a consequence of the changing economy after World War I. During the Roaring Twenties, optimism and affluence had risen like never before. The economy grew by 42%, average income rose by about $1,500, and unemployment stayed below 4%. In the wake of World War I, the U.S. was producing nearly half of global output, and mass production made consumer goods like refrigerators, washing machines, radios, and vacuums accessible to the average household. Investing in stocks became like baseball, a national pastime. As newspaper headlines trumpeted stories about teachers, chauffeurs, and maids making millions in the stock market, concerns about risk evaporated. Everyone wanted to get in on the action, and credit was readily available. In particular, businesses and individuals borrowed money to buy stocks on margin. Buying on margin meant that an investor could put down 10 to 20% of their own money and borrow the rest from their stockbroker. So if you wanted to buy $100 in stock, all you needed was $10 of your money, and the rest would be provided by a broker or from borrowed money from a bank. This type of leverage was extremely risky because if the stock price fell below the loan amount, the stockbroker could issue what was called a margin call, requiring immediate repayment of the loan. Despite this risk, even banks were buying stocks on margin, and since no law prevented it, some used their customers' deposits to do so. The chart here shows the Dow Jones Industrial Average, a measure of stock market performance from 1920 to September 1929, and how, for close to a decade, the stock market had consistently gone up. Well, much mythology surrounds these dramatic events in the autumn of 1929. Perhaps the most imperishable misconception portrays the crash as the cause of the Great Depression that persisted through the decade of the 1930s. But the problem with this conclusion is that almost 98% of the population owned no stock in 1929. Accordingly, the crash in itself had little direct or immediate economic effect on the typical American. Nor does it explain why the ensuing Great Depression lasted as long as it did. Many Americans who lived through the Great Depression were never able to forget the scenes of misery. In cities, the poor meekly awaited their turn at ill-funded soup kitchens, scavengers poked their garbage cans for food, scoured railroad tracks for coal that had fallen from trains, and sometimes ripped up railroad ties for fuel. Hundreds of thousands of Americans built makeshift shelters out of cardboard, scrap metal, and whatever else they could find in the city dump. They called their towns Hoovervilles after the president they despised for his apparent refusal to help them. Well, how did this happen? How did the United States go from a surging economy in the 1920s to the worst economic depression in American history? In today's lecture, we're going to examine these questions and look at how the United States, during the late 1920s and 1930s, found itself in a Great Depression, the most severe and sustained period of economic decline in U.S. history. The stock market speculation was certainly one of the contributing factors that led to the Depression, but changes to the economy after World War I, poor decision-making by the Federal Reserve Board, an ill-advised tariff that took effect soon after the Depression hit, and a lopsided concentration of wealth in the hands of the rich deepened the economic collapse and made recovery more difficult. Let's first look at the post-war economy. Immediately after World War I, the United States experienced a series of economic shocks. They began with rampant inflation as prices jumped by 1/3 in 1919 alone. Then came a 2-year recession that raised unemployment to 10%. Agriculture, which still employed 1/4 of all American workers, never fully recovered from the post-war recession. Once Europe's economy revived, its farmers flooded world markets with grain and other farm products, causing agricultural prices to fall. Other industries, including coal and textiles, languished for similar reasons. As a consequence, many rural Americans shared little of the decade's prosperity. The bottom 40% of American families earned an average annual income of only $725, about $9,100 today. Many, especially rural tenants and sharecroppers, languished in poverty and malnutrition. Widespread poverty and the lack of a quick economic recovery were compounded by mistakes by the Federal Reserve Board. Remember, the Federal Reserve Board controls the amount of money in circulation and interest rates, the price everyone pays to borrow money. High interest rates makes borrowing more expensive, which means people won't take out loans to purchase homes, cars, or to start a small business. When interest rates are low, the opposite occurs. People earn lower interest rates on their savings, but they can more easily borrow money for things they want to buy, like homes and cars. Most people don't have enough cash on hand to buy a house. They need credit, or a bank loan, or a mortgage to make this happen. And the lower interest rates, the better. But in 1930 and 1931, the Federal Reserve curtailed the amount of money in circulation and raised interest rates, thereby making credit more difficult for the public to secure. This tight money policy was a mistake. What the economy needed was an expanded money supply, lower interest rates, and easier credit. Such a source would have enabled debtors to pay their creditors. Instead, by choosing the opposite course, the Federal Reserve plunged an economy starved for credit deeper into depression. The Tariff Act of 1930, also known as the Hawley-Smoot Tariff, also accelerated economic decline abroad and at home. A tariff is just a tax to be paid on a particular class of imports or exports. The Hawley-Smoot tariffs not only raised tariffs or taxes on 75 agricultural goods, it also raised tariffs on 925 manufactured products. Industrialists had convinced their supporters in the Republican-controlled Congress that such protection would give American industry much-needed assistance. But the legislation was a disaster. Angry foreign governments retaliated by raising their own tariff rates to keep out American goods. This further hindered global trade and led to greater economic contraction throughout the industrialized world. When you hear politicians today discuss imposing high tariffs on China, the European Union, or Canada to level the playing field, many point to the Hawley-Smoot tariff as the perfect example of why not to do this. Beyond tariff, stock market speculation and inflation, the unequal distribution in the nation's wealth that had developed in the 1920s also stymied economic recovery. Between 1918 and 1929, the share of the national income that went to the wealthiest 20% of the population rose by more than 10%, while the share that went to the poorest 60% fell by almost 13%. President Calvin Coolidge's administration contributed to this maldistribution by lowering taxes on the wealthy. The deepening inequality of income distribution slowed consumption and held back the growth of consumer-oriented industries. Even when the rich spent their money lavishly, they still spent a smaller portion of their total incomes on consumption than wage earners did. There's simply only so much food or cars or clothes that one wealthy person can buy. Imagine if one wealthy Wall Street investor today had as much money as all the 15,000 students at City College combined. That investor may have a bigger apartment, a private plane, and his or her own yacht. But the investor can only eat so much. The investor can only wear so many clothes. And he or she can only take one seat at a movie theater or a Broadway show or purchase so many televisions, iPads, and smartphones. Instead of putting money into these items to stimulate the economy, the investor puts his or her disposable income into stocks, and therefore there's not enough money going into the general economy. Now, that's obviously a somewhat simplistic way to look at it, but you see my point. Had more of the total increase in national income found its way into the pockets of average Americans during the 1920s, the demand for consumer goods would have been steadier, and the newer consumer industries would have been correspondingly stronger. Such an economy might have recovered more quickly from the stock market crash of 1929, but recovery from the Great Depression did not come until 1941, more than a decade later. Part of that delay was the result of President Herbert Hoover's response. Hoover and Congress responded to the downturn by drawing on two powerful American traditions. The first was the belief that economic outcomes were the product of individual character. People's fate was in their own hands, and success went to those who deserved it. The second tradition held that through voluntary action, the business community could right itself and recover from economic downturns without relying on government assistance. In fact, many business leaders believed that financial panics and depressions, though painful, were part of a natural business cycle. Economic depressions, according to this theory, brought down inflated prices and cleared the way for real growth. Therefore, instead of using the powers of the federal government to stimulate economic growth, President Hoover asked Americans to tighten their belts and work hard. He put his faith in a voluntary system of associationalism, in which the federal government coordinated efforts of business and professional organizations to solve the nation's economic problems by crafting programs that state and local governments, along with private industry, could voluntarily implement. Hoover also adhered to the gold standard, which we now know added to the economic severity in the United States. Faced with economic catastrophe, both Great Britain and Germany abandoned the gold standard in 1931. When they did so, their economies recovered modestly. But the Hoover administration feared that such a move would weaken the value of the dollar. In reality, an inflexible money supply discouraged investment and therefore prevented growth. The president recognized that individual initiative, voluntarism, and high tariffs might not be enough given the depth of the crisis. So after several years with no real recovery, he called on state and local governments to provide jobs by investing in public projects. Hoover's most innovative program was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC, which provided federal loans to railroads, banks, and other businesses. Here, Hoover compromised his ideological principles. This was direct government intervention, not voluntarism. If he would support direct assistance to private industries, why not direct relief to the millions of unemployed? But the RFC lent money too cautiously, and by the end of 1932, after a year in operation, it had loaned out only 20% of its $1.5 billion in funds. Like most federal initiatives under President Hoover, the RFC was not nearly aggressive enough given the severity of the Depression. With federal officials fearing budget deficits and reluctant to intervene with the private market, caution was the order of the day. Few chief executives could have survived the downward economic spiral of 1929 to 1932. But Hoover's reluctance to break with the philosophy of limited government and his insistence that recovery was always just around the corner contributed to his unpopularity. By 1932, Americans perceived Hoover as insensitive to the depth of the country's economic suffering. As the Depression deepened, the American vocabulary now included the terms Hoovervilles, which were shanty towns where people lived in packing crates, and Hoover blankets, which were essentially newspapers. Bankrupt farmers banded together to resist the bank agents and sheriffs who tried to evict them from their land. To protect low prices for their goods, in the spring of 1932, thousands of Midwestern farmers joined the Farmers Holiday Association, which cut off supplies to urban areas by barricading roads and dumping milk, vegetables, and other foodstuffs onto the roadways. Agricultural prices were so low that the Farmers Holiday Association favored a government-sponsored farm program. In the industrial sector, layoffs and wage cuts led to violent strikes. When coal miners in Harlan County, Kentucky went on strike over a 10% wage cut in 1931, the mine owners called in the state's National Guard, which crushed the union. A 1932 confrontation between workers and security forces at the Ford Motor Company's giant River Rouge factory outside Detroit left 5 workers dead and 50 with serious injuries. Veterans staged the most publicized and most tragic protest. In the summer of 1932, the Bonus Army, a determined group of 15,000 unemployed World War I veterans, hitchhiked to Washington to demand immediate payment of pension awards that were due to be paid in 1945. "We were the heroes in 1917, but we're bums now," one veteran complained bitterly. While their leaders unsuccessfully lobbied Congress, the Bonus Army set up camps near the Capitol building. Hoover called out regular Army troops under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, who forcefully evicted the marchers and burned their main encampment to the ground. When newsreel footage showing the U.S. Army attacking and injuring veterans reached movie theaters across the nation, Hoover's popularity plunged. As the Depression worsened, the appeal of a strong leader, someone who would take decisive action, grew. In the presidential campaign of 1932, Democratic challenger Franklin Delano Roosevelt insisted that the federal government had to play a greater role. He supported direct relief payments for the unemployed, declaring that such governmental aid was a matter of social duty. He pledged a New Deal for the American people, though he was never very explicit about its outlines. Roosevelt committed to use the power of the federal government to combat the paralyzing economic crisis. Voters chose Roosevelt over Hoover overwhelmingly, 22.8 million to 15.8 million in the popular vote. We'll return to the New Deal later in the semester when we look at the rise of liberalism in the United States and how President Franklin Roosevelt tried to use the powers of the federal government to end the Great Depression.